Hey everyone, today we talk about the cold, hard logic that runs the world. We're talking about why nations clash, why peace is so fragile, and why the big debates in Washington about China feel so inevitable, so stuck on one track. The theory is called Structural Realism or Neorealism, and it's not optimistic, but it might be the most honest lens we have for looking at global power. The central conflict we're all living through right now is the tension between the United States, the established power, and China, the rising one. Structural realism tells us this conflict isn't really about communism versus democracy, or trade deficits or human rights. It's about something much more basic and primal. It's about the structure of the whole system. There's a bold claim, a conspiracy if you want to call it that, at the heart of this theory. The choices of our leaders matter a lot less than we think. We like to believe that if we just had the right president, the right diplomats, we could solve these problems. This theory says that's mostly an illusion. To get it, you have to compare it to the older idea, classical realism. That school of thought, championed by guys like Hans Morgenthau after World War II, basically said that conflict is baked into human nature. People are wired to want power, so the countries they lead are also power-hungry. It's a story about ambition and emotion. But structural realism, developed by Kenneth Waltz in his landmark 1979 book, Theory of International Politics, comes along and says, hang on, you're looking in the wrong place. It's not about the nature of man, it's about the nature of the international system. The motto is, don't blame the driver, blame the road. Even if every country were led by a saint, the structure of the world would force them into competition. Think of it like a game of pool. Waltz called it the billiard ball model. You have a bunch of billiard balls on a table. Does it matter if a ball is red, blue, striped, or solid? Not really. What matters is its size or its weight and its position on the table relative to the other balls. A big, heavy 8-ball is going to have more impact than a lighter cue ball, regardless of its color. In this analogy, the countries are the balls. Their internal politics, whether they're a democracy like the U.S. or a one-party state like China, that's just their color. What really dictates how they move and collide are their capabilities, their economic might, their military strength, and their position in the system. The table itself, with its hard rails and the laws of physics, that's the international structure. This brings us to the core ideas, and the first and most important one is anarchy. It doesn't mean chaos and riots in the streets. In international relations, anarchy simply means there is no world government. There's no global 911 you can call when you're in trouble. If a country is invaded, there's no ultimate authority to step in and save them. This one fact changes everything. Because there's no world police, every country is forced into a system of self-help. You can have allies, you can have friends, but at the end of the day, you are responsible for your own survival. This isn't paranoia, it's just logic. And in a self-help world, what's the #1 goal for any nation? It's not prosperity, it's not spreading its values, it is simply survival. To survive, you need power. This leads directly to the most tragic part of the whole theory, the security dilemma. Let's map this onto the U.S. and China. China sees the U.S. Navy patrolling the South China Sea and feels threatened, so it builds up its own navy and constructs military bases on artificial islands to protect its shipping lanes. It's a defensive move from their perspective. As Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin asserted to the press, U.S. actions are a form of navigation hegemony, and China's own military drills are necessary to safeguard its territorial sovereignty. But how does the U.S. and its allies like Japan and the Philippines see it? They see an aggressive China trying to dominate the region. So the U.S. increases its naval patrols and strengthens its alliances. On May 10, 2024, for instance, the guided missile destroyer USS Halsey conducted a freedom of navigation operation within 12 nautical miles of the Paracel Islands, which the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet Public Affairs Office stated was to challenge excessive maritime claims by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam. In a fiery response, the People's Liberation Army's Southern Theater Command announced it carried out its own air and sea patrols to track, monitor, and drive away the American warship, a claim the U.S. Navy disputed. Suddenly, two countries that might not have wanted a war are armed to the teeth and staring each other down. It's a vicious cycle where steps taken to increase your own security are seen as a threat by your rival, making everyone less secure. The structure of the system creates this trap. Another key idea is relative gains. In our personal lives, we're usually happy with absolute gains. If you and your neighbor both get a pay raise, that's great. You're both better off. But countries, especially great powers, think differently. They think in terms of relative gains. It's not how much did I get, it's how much did I get compared to you. If there's a trade deal on the table where the U.S. economy grows by $50 billion, but China's economy grows by $100 billion, a structural realist would say the U.S. should reject that deal. Why? Because even though America is better off in absolute terms, its main competitor is now relatively stronger. The power gap has closed. This logic is on full display in Washington's recent policies on technology. U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, in a discussion about the fierce competition over advanced semiconductors, has been clear that a primary goal of U.S. export controls is to create speed bumps to slow China's technological advancement. As reported by Asia Times on December 22, 2024, while she admits that trying to hold China back is a fool's errand, the entire strategy is built on the idea that the U.S. must run faster, out-innovate them. This explains why deep, trusting cooperation between great powers is so difficult and often short-lived. Now, within this big theory, there are two major branches, and this is where it gets really interesting. The first is defensive realism, which is what Waltz, the founder, believed. He argued that the anarchic world pushes countries to seek just enough power to be secure. The goal is security maximization, not power maximization. If you become too powerful, if you aim for global domination or hegemony, you'll scare everyone else. Other countries will form a coalition and balance against you, which ultimately makes you less secure. So, for a defensive realist, the smart move is to maintain the status quo, to be powerful enough to defend yourself, but not so powerful that you become the world's boogeyman. But then comes the other branch, the one that's really gained traction online and in policy circles, and that's offensive realism, most famously associated with John Mearsheimer. He looks at the same anarchic world and draws a much darker conclusion. Mearsheimer says the tragedy of great power politics is that the security dilemma is inescapable and brutal. Because you can never be certain of another state's intentions, the only rational way to ensure your survival is to maximize your power. The ultimate goal isn't just to be secure, it's to become the hegemon, the undisputed dominant power in your region. The United States did this in the Western Hemisphere. It pushed out all the European powers in the 19th century to become the regional hegemon. According to Mearsheimer, this is the only way to be truly safe. And this is his stark prediction for us now. China will try to do the same in Asia. It will try to push the U.S. out to become the dominant regional power because its leaders, looking at the structure of the world, will see it as the only surefire path to long-term survival. The U.S., as the established power, will do everything it can to prevent that from happening. For an offensive realist, this isn't a policy choice, it's a structural inevitability. In a December 2024 interview with the Chinese newspaper Guancha, Mearsheimer put it bluntly, security competition between China and the United States is inevitable, but the war can be prevented.
He calls this dynamic, and the title of his most famous book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. It's a tragedy unfolding according to a predetermined script. So, what's the concluding thought here? The idea of structural realism is deeply unsettling because it suggests we have very little agency. It paints a world where conflict is baked into the system, a system with no exit. It suggests that whether it's the US or China
versus the Soviet Union in the Cold War, or the US versus China today, the names and faces may change, but the underlying dynamic of fear, self-help, and the struggle for power remains constant. It's a pessimistic view, maybe even a fatalistic one, but it forces us to ask a hard question. Is the tension we feel with China the result of bad decisions and misunderstandings, or is it the inevitable grinding of the gears of the international system itself? Structural realism tells us to look past the headlines and the angry rhetoric, and instead look at the cold, hard map of power. Because on that map, the game has its own brutal rules.